Day 9 of 11 Days of Remembrance. Bombing the cities. The air war over Europe. In 1941, the British bombing offensive over Germany was still comparatively small. No matter that, precision bombing was impossible at night, and the daylight bombing was impossible without fighter cover. No matter the infinitely more aircrew were lost than Germans killed, bombing was even as one of the few ways in which Britain could strike back at the enemy and disrupt the lessons of the Blitz. Bomber Command believed that airstrikes would weaken German morale. Night after night, RAF Wellingtons and Halifaxes made the horrendous journey across the North Sea and through a storm of flak to drop their payloads on German cities. In November 1941, a temporary halt to the offense was ordered, but the dream of bombing Germany into submission remained. Enormous industrial resources in Britain and America were devoted to the strategy, while over more pressing needs, such as fighting the U-boat war in the Atlantic, were selected. By early 1942, British bombers had been fitted with radio detectional equipment to help them find more specific targets, but a directive issued on Valentine's Day emphasized that the new bombing policy was aimed not at underestimating German industrial capability per se, but at destroying the morale of industrial workers. Sir Arthur Holdsworth, who had studied the methods adopted by the Luftwaffe during the Blitz, was put in charge of Bomber Command. A few days later, he and his American counterparts, now based in British airfields, developed their own strategies, sure they could win the war from the air. Harris began his treasure by ordering an industrial raid on the historic town of Lüneburg. Lüneburg was not a vital target, says Harris later, but it seemed to me better to destroy an industrial town of moderate importance than to total to destroy a large industrial city. Some 15,000 civilians lost their homes. Lüneburg was followed by 4 raids on Rostock in April. In May, the first 1,000 bomber raid was mounted with Cologne as the target. 40 bombers were downed, and unknown to the British public, the city was operating normally again within 2 weeks. Harris knew the raids were ineffective, but argued that they were good practice for later raids, and the myth of flattering morale in German cities drove him and his critical minds to devote even more effort and lives to the project. By the summer 1942, improved German air defenses meant the Bomber Command was losing an average of 3.5% of planes on every mission. At the Casablanca Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed on round-the-clock bombing of Axis targets, the new British Lancasters flying by night and the American B-17 flying fortresses by day. Berlin, the target of 15,000 tons of bombs in 1943 alone, but when the strategic bombing rates were at their height, so was German industrial production. Surprised on by Hitler headquarters Albert Spencer, now Nazi minister in charge of war production, at the stage. Then the raids were having small impact on Germany's industrial base. Their extraction was a series of bold RAF strikes at the industrial room from March to July 1943, the so-called Dam Busters raids, in which the city carried total 6 medatrain 617 squadron used by Dr. Burns Wallace experimentally bounced bombs to breach 3 major dams and flooded the valleys below. 8 of the 19 bombers taking part in the missions were lost. After July, the port of Hamburg became the Allies' major target, surfing 33 raids. The biggest, known as Operation Gunbroof, took place in the early hours of 28th July. Though the raids lasted only 43 minutes, the combination of industrial bombings and later city conditions produced a forestorm which burned out 8 square miles of the city and killed 42,000 people. Were then the numbers of British casualties for the whole of the Blitz. Nevertheless, the city's factories were back in production within a few weeks. From November 1943, attention shifted to Berlin, placing Stalin and relieving Churchill of Soviet pressure for the imminent Second Front. Losses were now running at over 5%, however, and bomber command morale was being stripped. The American 8th Air Force sustained still greater losses. The military efficiency of the bombing campaign was not being questioned by Harris superiors, and at the morality by churchmen, notable by the Bishop of Chester, George Bell, who lost his chance of being Archbishop of Charity as a result. Even Churchill had his doubts. "Are we beasts?" he asked after seeing a film of bombing from the air. "Are we taking this too far?" By early 1944, Harris was having to ask for night fighter support for his bombers. The 8th Air Force was already using its new long-range fighter, the Mustang, for the task, and had now shifted its daylight attacks on German Sonific oil and ball-bearing plants, initially denying the development and intrusion of the new German jet aircraft and long-range submarines. In preparations for a future Second Front, both British and American bombing raids continued on destroying German transport in France. The danger here, as Churchill saw it, was the incremental bombing would allocate the French population. The mission simply had to be accurate. With disparate military planning, many bombs went wide of the mark. In April 1943, as many as 228 French civilians were killed in an American raid on the Revent factory outside Paris, while another US AAF attack on an aircraft factory near Antwerp killed nearly 1,000 civilians, including 236 school children. The raids on German cities didn't succeed in removing German air defenses from the Russian front, but with the benefit of hindsight, it appeared the situation over terror bombing and mainly negotiating genetic consequences. The civilian crowds in the shelters under the turned under the bombs, they were resolved did not collapse like the buildings outside. Far from it. Withstanding the deaths of innocents, old people, women, and children, only hundred of the hatred of the population for the Allied raids in the skies. The Nazi propaganda machine was this handed victory upon victory. Alright, let's go to the next chapter, shall we? The swift underbelly, Allied landings in the Mediterranean. Ever since he had completed military strategy as First Lord of the Academy during the Great War, Churchill had believed that Europe was vulnerable to attack from the south. The belief he had led him into the Jewish Gallipoli campaign of 1915, just as it had led him to circumvent Greek defenses in 1941. In May 1943, as he pored over the maps in Washington with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he once again urged a Mediterranean offense, namely the invasion of Italy via Sicily, and of northern Europe via Austria. Italy's war effort had already been seriously undermined. Little remains of Mussolini's military strength and the conquest of North Africa, the Mediterranean was once again open to Allied convoys. When the Japanese ambassador went to see Mussolini in 1942, all he could say to him was, You deuce, you worn out, very worn out, too worn out. It was the point that the man who never was, a corpse dressed as a British officer and bringing fake documents implying that an Allied invasion was planned for Greece and Sardinia, which washed up in Spain and may have succeeded in dropping Nazi intelligence. Whether or not this was so, on 10th of July 1943, Montgomery's force of nearly 500,000 men landed in Sicily, almost unopposed. The Americans, however, suffered resistance at the same time. A feud between Montgomery and the headstrong American General Patton over strategy, so that when almost a delay before the Allied forces managed to take Pioneino and Minnesota in August, and in a kind of mini Dunkirk carried out in 70 small naval vessels and 50 rubber boats, many Axis troops managed to escape to the mainland with their equipment. Hitler and Mussolini had met on 19th July. Mussolini was ill and barely spoke. He faced not simply invasion but economic collapse. Turn and Milan were in the grasp of major strikes. Less than a week later, King Victor Emile III dismissed him from office and installed Marshal Bruno in his place. Mussolini was smuggled out of the palace and then taken by ambulance to the island of Portugal for his own safety. Almost overnight, fascism disappeared from Italy. Hitler was deeply concerned. A conversation between Roosevelt and Churchill discussing the terms for Italy's surrender had been interpreted by the agents. Ramil was sent to the Alpine passes and covered over, giving reinforcements in southern Italy. By the beginning of September, the Germans were deeply injured. On 8th of September, the Allies unexpectedly announced the surrender of Italian forces, even though the Italians had still recovered no orders to the effect. At the same time, a massive Allied landing was steaming towards the beaches of Salino. The fate of the Italian troops was unforgettable. They were disarmed by their former allies who treated them as no better than turncoats, and captured in Greece. Over 16,000 Italian soldiers were slaughtered by the SS. Another 3,000 Italians sent back to Germany for forced labor were drowned when their ship was torpedoed by the Allies. By the end of September 1943, 100,000 Italian soldiers in Greece had been sent to labor camps in Germany, and Bernardino and the Italian king had been forced to flee to Berino. Only the remainder of the Italian fleet managed to escape, sailing to join the British and Matera. At midnight on 9th of September, the U.S. Fifth Army under Clark began to land at Sorrento, opposed by 6 of Kesselring's divisions. Resistance was at first so fierce that the operation nearly ended in evacuation. The new German guide bombs disabled the British battleship Mercury and had been supporting the landings, and sank the Italian battleship Roma, now on the Allied side. Continental force also succeeded in capturing the Italian naval port of Ternino. Other Mediterranean landings met with immediate success. The Germans withdrew from Cusco, and ahead of the Free French, which American troops took Caprari, but German reinforcements on the Greek island of Rhodes followed, and British landings there. On 12th of September, German paratroopers rescued and exerted Mussolini from the mountain of Guernsey, where he was being kept by Italian police. He was flown to meet Hitler and proclaimed a new fascist republic in German-occupied northern Italy. He was to be given some reason to hope that the Germans might prove victorious in his country, though the Allies took Naples on 1st of October. From that point until the end of 1943, they managed to advance only 70 miles. The situation of the whole campaign on the Italian front, it becoming suspicious, stormed Churchill's Kissing had been expecting an attack on Rome by air and sea, which might have forced him to abandon the south, which was the chance to build up his defenses. There was worse news to come for the Allies. The delays convinced serious long-term information that the Americans in southern Italy had raided, groomed the mafia, rooted out by the fascists. It remains powerful there to this day. An Italian resistance group in Rome was campaigning for the king to be overthrown, as well as the Russians were refused a place on the Anglo-American Control Commission for Occupied Italy, setting a dangerous predicament for the control of Eastern Europe after the war. Another operator who made excessive use of the Italian surrender was Joseph Brunel Ternino, the successful Yugoslav communist leader who disarmed Italian troops and took their equipment. Ternino was the army colonel. Joseph Mozovic now controlled 250,000 men and were keeping 8 Sun Rifle and back 8 German divisions landing in Yugoslavia. Churchill was noted that the son Rudolf was begging Trentino because he was more active. They were still banking Maverick. Meanwhile, the American Fifth Army was crawling up the west of Italy with the British Eighth Army, now under the command of Sir Oliver Lee. Coming over the east, there was certainly taking their time. Through the early months of 1944, the Allies were obstructed by the German fortifications. The Gutzlaff Line, south of Rome, a successful landing at Egino on 22nd of January looked set to break the deadlock. Only 13 soldiers were killed coming ashore, but once again Allied generals were in search of, and soon the whole offensive was threatened as Kelso rushed reinforcements to the area. In the center of the Allied advance lay the ancient monastery of Mount Cassino, which Alexander believed he'd been fortified by the Germans. On 13 February, 400 tons of bombs were dropped on the monastery, reducing it to rubble. The Germans who held back from entering the monastery were now prepared to use the ruins to initiate their defense. On 3 attacks, the Allies suffered aggressive loss. The starting point was finally taken in May 1944, where the Polish corps took the brunt of the German response, which Free French troops under General John managed to sneak through the mountains behind, but Allied confusion again delayed the advance up Italy. Determined to reach Rome first, which he did on 4th of June, Clark allowed the retreating Germans to reinforce another defensive line further north of the capital. The Italian campaign was demoralizing from the Allied point of view. At every river, every range of the hills, they faced a strong of skilled German rear-guard actions. The discern rate by the end of 1944, however, Canadian forces had taken Riviana through there had not been reached. Bologna or the village of the Po as the had entered, ready for the drive north into Austria, but a German counterattack on 26 December and the removal of another 5 Allied divisions to the Western Front from the British and Americans to go on the offense and set tight until spring 1945. Well, that concludes day 9 of 11 Days of Remembrance. Well, I thank the veterans for fighting for me to be free until I can do these videos. If you see a veteran, walk up to them and say thank you, and if they're having a bad day, give them tea or coffee. Well, this concludes day 9, 11 Days of Remembrance.